Welcome to the Organic Filaments Network. I'm Sher Ali Khan. Today I'm joined by Emon H. an organizer with Black Mindedness. Across Black hope and practice and disorder notes towards an anti-political conception of Blackness. His work takes a Blackness, Blackening, political life, imposed order, refusal, and what he calls hope and practice, drawing from the radical tradition and Black anarchist thought in engagement with thinkers like Calvin Warren, Marquise Bey, Ashanti Alston, and Lorenzo Irvin. His writing insists that Blackness cannot be understood through the political's terms. We focus today on hope, political life, Blackening, necessary disorder, and Black refusal. How are you doing, Emon?
I'm doing pretty good, having a pretty decent start to my day. So yeah, I'm doing pretty good.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about your organization, Black Mindedness, and what it stands for and what you're trying to build out there in Virginia.
Yeah. So Black Mindedness is a Black autonomous organization. It didn't start like that. We started it back in 2024 as kind of a organization that was aimed at kind of raising a more radical consciousness between Black students on campus and folks in the surrounding area. But over time, obviously, as the commitments deepened, then we moved beyond that and kind of expanded that into more grassroots centered work that's focused on meeting community needs, building grassroots power, and forwarding our people's self determination out across Roanoke and New River Valley regions of Virginia. So do the standard things, all the door knockings, all the community service things, and just trying to draw people into that type of work that's aimed towards a more liberatory objective. And yeah, we just trying to lock in with that. That's what Black Mindedness is about, though.
Excellent. In Black hope in practice, those made Black are described as living, dying in the political world,
Mhm.
as the hopeless of that world. What does that clarify about the relation between Black life and political life?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the relation to between Black life and political life, especially as like I try to describe it across Black hope and practice and disorder, is kind of this internally contradictory thing, right? Like necessarily in terms of how the political justifies itself, right? You have a situation where there's something it has to justify itself against, right? And this is something that'll come up across disorder, but there's a certain need to do ordering that the political has, right? It's constituted to order the world in accordance with a certain hierarchical dynamic or a certain relationship of subjugation that's unsustainable, right? So when it encounters Blackness and what Blackness is constituted or created to do, right, and reproduced as, is that kind of force and element that is the disorderly, that is the threat to what the political is. And this is why there's like this contradiction when we talk about living and we talk about having hope and different things like that. Because when we're talking about trying to live through the political, you're living in accordance with the order being described and shaped by these powers that end up blackening Black people, right? And so yeah, that's essentially the core thing. And when you take on life and you embrace life through that type of order and live in accordance with that, then you necessarily position yourself against Black life, which cannot live in that particular type of order, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. And uh, political life is granted on condition that one builds life through ongoing Black death. What does that
Mhm.
condition secure for the political world?
Uh, yeah. So basically, to understand ongoing Black death, it's to understand the practice of blackening, or maybe not even just the practice of blackening, but the systematic violence that blackening that constitutes that process, right? So essentially, how I describe it, and this is kind of something I reflected on, I think, post the article coming out that was Black Hope and Practice, but blackening in itself is this like project of like just blanket violence. You know how Fanon talks about how colonialism is blanket violence essentially, right? Blackening, we're talking about a similar type of thing What we're discussing, though, is we're talking about a type of genocidal violence, right? That is not aimed at the erasure or the end or the extermination of a people. You see what I mean? It's the genocidal violence for its own sake, right? Similar to what Afro pessimists talk about throughout their literature. So this type of genocidal violence that ends up getting carried out against African people manifests in different ways, but the main two systems they constitute themselves in and enshrine themselves in are carceral and colonial systems. We see a heavy colonial dynamic that affects Black people, and that heavy carceral aspect that affects our people. And through the systematization of these things, that violence that initially did that blackening and that initially structured a type of political world that's oriented and geared towards the dehumanization of Black people, right? The same violence that constituted those things ends up undermining and underpinning every single system, whether that be economic, whether that be the social ordering systems, whether that be whatever system we want to talk about, right? That's what ends up undergirding it because of that system. And this is why we see all these institutions basically playing out at that continue of inflicting inflicting death, whether literal or a type of internal feeling of it, right? Creating the conditions that produce death across Black communities and for Black people, right? And that's essentially what ongoing Black death is. It's that whole construction, right? And we see it manifest across different contexts. Um, and there's one more thing I forgot to mention just now about that is that there's, as I said, like the process of blackening is aimed to kind of not to exterminate, right? But it's a violence that's aimed at in creating a certain state of being, right? It's trying to enshrine a type of objecthood. You know what I mean? It's trying to the violence is there for itself, and the violence that's just there to be violence against the thing, right, ends up signaling to the world around us, whether that be people, whether that be institutions, whether that be whatever, right? It signals that this thing, this Black thing it's just an object. You know what I mean? You do whatever you please to it. Just as we raped and maimed and murdered and tortured and captured and exploited these people, right? Just as we did all of these things to make this world and to build it up and to make it what it is and to enshrine our power, you can do the same thing and find your power and your life and your hope in that same process, right? And that's what the buy-in becomes. It sells it to everybody who wants to constitute themselves as living properly. You know what I mean? Yeah, that's basically the idea behind it.
That's interesting because in your work, you expose how political hope is built on the same ground as political life. What makes political hope inseparable from political hopelessness, as you frame it?
Yeah, so political hopelessness, right? This is a type of state. And the interesting thing about it is I started really liking them brackets because the brackets are so like signal so much, I feel like, because you have two things going on, right? You have a situation where it's like, okay, there's a certain political hope that is within the bounds of the order that is the political, right? That the political shapes, that the political embodies, right? So you have a certain order that's structured against Black life, right? And within these bounds, you have certain positions you can get to. You can become the rich and wealthy capitalist. You can become the political statesman. You can become the police officer, the military official. You can become all of these different things, right? If you just buy in, right? And orient all of your energies towards reaching that center, right? Yeah, you may be on the margins. Even at amongst Black people, we see this. Maybe on the margins. Okay, cool. But just buy into the political. The moment you buy into it, you set. You know what I mean? And this is where the hope is. This is that the request for representation when representation does nothing to end up getting us free, right? This is the request or this is the trying to play off of Black buying power and all of these silly things, trying to build up the Black businesses that aren't oriented towards serving Black communities primarily, but are oriented towards building their own selves up. These businesses that aren't aimed at any form of economic alternative building, but instead integration and incorporation into the broader system we're living in, right? So it's a thing about orientation, right? When somebody seeks to seeks to build themselves up, right? Get a form of redress, right? A form of representation, a form of incorporation in the political world, within the political, and they look towards these different political mechanisms to achieve these things, and they put their hope in these things. That's when they engage in political hope, right? The interesting thing is, though, that on a structural level, on a systematic level, what's happening is that because the political is structured and necessarily produces ongoing Black death, that ongoing Black death simultaneously, while the political is this person who's orienting their energies towards incorporation, while the political is their hope. At the same time, because of what the political is structured against, ongoing Black death is also their hope. You see what I mean? And this is why we have a situation where the Black being, Blackness, becomes a form of political hope. But when you look at the people, when you look at the condition that Blackness instills on people because of how it's positioned in a political context, what we have is a political hopelessness, right? So that political hope is built on the hopelessness of the condition that a group of people is dealing with and going through. And that's the core. That's the interesting turn there. It's like, whoa, what? Like that's a weird dynamic at play, you know?
Yeah. In your reading of MLK Jr.'s Jr., you refer to the capacity to endure suffering, and where like resilience appears consistent with the integration into the political world. What does
Mhm.
resilience make possible for the political world?
Yeah. So it's interesting, like with the MLK, what I found interesting about MLK, right? And you know how usually like we think about MLK and we're like, okay, like a genuinely principled person, but it's like you have the wrong, like some conceptions are a little skewed, and we think it's a largely a strategic or tactical problem with him. I remember when I went back after watching or reading through Calvin Warren's Black Nihilism and the Politics of Hope, which he referenced this same speech. I'm sitting here and I'm reading it, and he's referring to what Dr. King is talking about and pointing to its consistency. He didn't point to this was a flaw. He said, no, this is rather consistent. He's naming something important for Black nihilists to engage with, right? And it's like, okay, so let me see what he's naming. I went back and watched the whole speech, back through it, read through it, and all these different things. And I'm looking at the speech, and I said, oh my goodness, when he says that we can't, like he said, we can and must stand up against our most violent opponent and say we will match your capacity to inflict suffering by our capacity to endure suffering. We will ride you down by our capacity to suffer. What is he really talking about? He's talking about this deep spiritual embrace of that condition of ongoing Black death. That's what he's talking about. And he's saying, embrace it and just struggle through it because we can survive through it in somewhere along the way, right? If we get these certain things, if we do it long enough, then we will be incorporated into the dream in a way that isn't dehumanizing, right? And that's the tough part, because it's like two things. One, it'll always be dehumanizing. But then the second thing is, you're right. If you suffer long enough, if you allow yourself to orient further into the political, right? Even if it's constituting itself against your very being, eventually you will just be fully integrated into it. You will have a hard time imagining, you'll have a harder and harder time imagining the way out, right? And as more and more people who are in that sphere trying to orient themselves towards further incorporation embrace that, the more and more it'll be hard for the people who can't find their way there to move these people out of that center and towards rupture, right? So he's naming this, and it's like, okay, here's the bigger problem here, right? It's not the fact that he had a strategic misstep. It's not just the fact that he thought that nonviolence was a principle instead of a tactic. A bigger problem and a bigger thing for us to identify is that he named the right thing. That this world, in order for us to get to where we would imagine any dreams we can have within this world, right? Any dreams we can have within this world are dreams that are built on our suffering, right? And suffering is distinct from struggle, right? So yeah, we can suffer and suffer and suffer and suffer all day, right? But if there's not a struggle we're engaging in, right? And if we're not taking up the hardest struggle to reach a state of humanization that can be imagined, right, without the confines of the political, then we are just suffering for suffering's sake. And this is something that Calvin Warren points out additionally, right? And that's why it's so vital for us to let go of that and
Mm-hmm.
say, yes, we are made to suffer in this world, right? But we're not going to suffer for suffering's sake. We're going to recognize that this world is built for us to suffer in it. It's built on Black suffering, and therefore we're going to struggle against it and struggle to bring it all down, right? And as we do that, we embrace a different type of resilience. You see what I mean? Black resilience becomes a different thing, right? We're not talking about Black resilience as the method. We're talking about Black resilience as a product and something that is baked into a type of refusal, a type of resistance that's just like pointed clearly against the political, which is harming us at present.
Absolutely. Building on that, blackening names the process by which the white man secures himself as a master owner by turning human chattel into expressed reality. What does blackening reveal about the continuation of that relation beyond formal slavery? Or
Yeah.
how
So
does blackening operate now?
yeah. So basically, interesting. One thing I identify. I really wish some of these things I had put it like I'd actually put in the original article, but I like this is why I'm like reworking it. I've been reworking it for a little bit. But in terms of the white man, no, I did put this in there that it constitutes white hegemonic society. And the idea behind this is to say like the white man is obviously like it's a shorthand for a society built to prop up whiteness and white people, right? And the interesting part thing about the dynamic of blackening, the process through which the white man becomes the white man, is that he always has to do it. Like there's not a point where he can't do it, right? The process of blackening isn't a process that happens
Yeah.
and then we have this world now. Now it's a thing of okay, we have to reproduce this over and over and over and over again, right? So what the white man does, what white hegemonic society does, what the political world even is, right? It's society as imagined up. It's the world as imagined up through a type of, not white at the time, but a type of white type of eyes, right? Something that could prop up whiteness at the top of a particular hierarchy, right? This world comes into being once the violence necessary to blacken a set of individuals, to colonize the entire planet, to spread an economic system that is built on the exploitation of regular people. Once all of these things happen, what we have now is the conditions for the political world to exist. All we need is the political apparatus. Okay. Now we have the political, right? The political emerges out of a need for it, right? It emerges with these things, but I'm kind of shorthanding for the sake of it, right? So it emerges out of these things, right? The blanket violence creates the world. Now, once the apparatuses are in place, all that's happening is it's structuring itself, right? It's systematizing itself. It's making itself be able to consistently reproduce itself. And it's funneling the energies of everybody lying within the order that is the political into that reproduction. So whenever we uphold capitalist institutions, what are we doing? We're reproducing the very structures that are making up this political world, right? Whenever we buy in to these political institutions and these political apparatuses that are built against Black people, as I'm talking about in this context, then what are we doing? We're upholding that same world, right? And when we into whatever it may be, when we basically order our steps in accordance to what's been ordained by the white man, then we reify his position. And that's what the systems are built for us to do. And that's a vital thing for us to recognize and actually move towards, as I say, refusing and kind of trying to, make something different shape.
So, yeah, much of your works in dialogue with Calvin Warren's concept of ontological terror, especially his claim that law integrates the slave into the world as property. And
Mhm.
how does that integration persist in the present?
I'm sorry, could you say the last part
Or
again? I'm
is
sorry.
the or how does that integration persist in the present political formation? Is integration itself violence?
Okay. So the way that I see kind of Calvin Warren's understanding of the law integrating us in as chattel as like proverbially and non-human it's say it's even more of an all-encompassing aspect than what would be commonly understood when we just understand it through the context of the law, right? What we see, and this is something Duby and ID gets at, right, is what that integration looks like, right, is also in the again the condition it puts us in, right? I know Martin Sostre, right? He had gotten out of when he had gotten out of prison. What did he say? He said, "In prison, we're living in a big prison, right? We're in a big carceral state, right? But in prison is the high security zone, right? And outside of it is the low security zone, right? Low security, lower surveillance, right? And this is the interesting aspect of it. When we talk about Black communities, we're talking about communities that are, I don't want to say over policed, because any type of policing is over policing, but let's say, for lack of a better term, over police communities. You know what I mean? These are communities that are targeted,
Yeah.
right, in order to be surveilled and policed and secured and you feel me, all of these different things, right, in a way that other communities just aren't, right? And this isn't like some arbitrary thing, right? And it's also not this hyper intentional thing at the present moment. Right now, it's the fact that our communities have been structurally deprived of the resources we need to live well. We've been structurally deprived, and we've had at every turn when we've tried to build it up for ourselves, the power to live free stripped away from us through carceral carceral systems, through the internal colonization that Black communities, new African communities see in the US, right? So it's like, okay, this is the condition we're facing, right? So now what do we end up doing? Like in our own communities, we end up operating in a fashion that replicates the world that is holding us captive, right? And now the struggle, what the struggle is to break out of that alongside with bringing down the prisons, bringing down the police, bringing down all of these bodies of carceral control, right? And that's the dual character to it. So what I'm getting at is kind of like where we see the fact that the law has integrated us in as human chattel, as something to be hyper police, as something to be treated as right, is in the conditions our communities are facing. And when we go to our communities and when we discuss with our people, what we end up doing is we have to look at our conditions and look at how the condition of, you know what I mean, of say ongoing Black death, or say that criminalization, how that's manifesting in a particular context, right? And be able to play off of that and
Yeah.
explain why refusal is so vital because of that condition in itself. Yeah.
And in your disorder article, you distinguish between power as capacity and power in and power to, and power as a social phenomena. And why is that distinction sort of necessary for understanding Blackness?
Yeah, that distinction is necessary, and this is the beautiful part about like anarchism's analysis of power, right? It provides that type of a distinction just baked into it, you know. Because what ends up happening is a lot of times when I've had discussions, whether it be with people who are more liberal, whether it be with like Marxist Leninist types and different people along those lines, what you see is this conflation of power, and everything about power is power too. You know what I mean? If a thing can do this thing, then it is this, right? If one person can tell somebody else what to do, that means they have authority over them. And it's like, no, that's
Hmm.
not how power works, right? Power works in two different spheres, right? When we have powers and individual capacities to do things, right? I can say that I can go walk across this room per se, right? I can say that that this school, right, let's say can I don't know, ask for some money from me, right? We can say
Hmm.
that there's a certain power to do certain things, whether that be walk or make a request, right? But the power
Hmm.
to impose that on somebody else, the power to use it to subjugate somebody else, the power to enforce, like use your power to force somebody else to, right? By means of violence and by means of coercion and by means of all these different things. These dynamics of interpersonal, inter-entity violence don't exist without two entities being present, right? These dynamics of coercion don't exist without there being two parties in the picture, right? And that means necessarily when we're talking about power in a relational capacity, we're not talking about the same thing as power in terms of individual capacities. What we're talking about power in terms of is how it looks between two people, right? And That's
Mhm.
where we get this important dynamic, right? That anarchism especially names is, okay, how do we want to see that power structured, right? There's no way to get rid of it,
Mm.
right? It's just there. It's the force that's in the world, right? So there's no way to get rid of it. How do we structure it? What do we do with it? And that's why kind of that kind of breakdown of those different dynamics is baked into the analysis of disorder and is named very clearly and concretely, because once we go out and we're trying to actually do the work, when we're trying to go out and organize, when we're trying to explain to people why, the condition is what it is and why it feels like there's no power, it's important to name, no, you have power to do things. That now the thing is to use that power to change the way power is structured. You see what I mean? And we have to move that
Mhm.
from power over where people, you feel me, we can have a dynamic have a dynamic of capitalism, of white supremacy, of all these different things through that dynamic of hierarchical power, and change that to a power with where it's equal footing. And how that looks is a whole nother conversation. But, like, that's such an important thing to name.
Yeah, and in that same article, I believe you speak about blackness uh, uh, in terms of necessary disorder, as an inevitable. There's this inevitability as resistance and foundational to what the political must contain. Why is that foundationally so decisive?
Yeah. Because this is again, this is another one of the things I think a lot of times one of the critiques I hear a lot about Afro pessimism, and like I think like informed critiques can be good, right? But one of the critiques I often hear is you're like essentializing racism, right? You're essentializing anti-black racism. And it's like, well, no, racism and anti-blackness are two very distinct things, and we have to name them as such, right? It's the same way racism and colonialism are two different things, right? We have to distinguish them as such. Yes, racism exists and will emerge, right, under colonial dynamics in an anti Black order, right? However, that does not mean it is constitutive of these things. It does not mean these things embody racism necessarily, right? Racism is an effectual thing,
Mhm.
right? So the reason it's so important to point to that is the fact that an effectual thing like racism, if it is baked into a structure of power, can lead to a hierarchy emerging, right? Okay. Now, when people say, oh, you're conflating racism and anti-blackness, what they're thinking of anti-blackness as is just the dynamic of white supremacy in which there is a racial hierarchy, right? And this is not what
Yeah.
we're talking about, right? That racial hierarchy is what produces the is what a certain resistance is oriented against, right? Okay, you have a dynamic where people are subjugated because they are not white. Well, what are people going to necessarily do because of the conditions that puts on them? They're going to struggle against that framework or the people who are subjugating them, right? This is where we have the inevitability of resistance, right? And I wish I would have detailed it more in the article or in the essay, but there's never been a point where we've seen just full on people just accept their subjugation. So resistance is inevitable in conditions of hierarchy, right? However, let's say if people who are racialized, well, everybody's racialized, but if the people who are subjugated because of race, right, we're like, you know what, we're
Mhm.
just not going to resist. That doesn't make the hierarchy go away. The subjugation is still there,
Yeah.
right? So we have a
Mhm.
situation where that subjugating dynamic, no matter what happens, it can remain, right? The resistance isn't what's necessary for the hierarchy to exist, right? But the resistance is
Yeah.
produced because the hierarchy exists and the conditions that come along with it. Okay, so that's what we have with white supremacy, and that's what we have with a racial hierarchy. That's what racism racism infused with a power structure might do, right, or will do, right? When it comes to anti-blackness, we're not talking about hierarchy, right? We're talking about an
Mhm.
order. We're talking about how the world is constituted. We're talking about how white supremacy reifies itself in what's that almost a necessary antagonism underlying the racial hierarchy and other systems of the like, right? So what we're talking about
Mhm.
is not the hierarchy or the social phenomenon of how power is distributed. What we're instead talking about is the thing that is the order that maintains that, right? And this is where the political is so important. So we remove the question of power from our discussion of blackness. What we're talking about now is okay, how does this order justify its existence? How does it make it clear that it must be there, right? And that's where we see a need for a disorder, right? In the essay, I put it as hold on, X only if I and Z, right? If X was the political
Yeah.
and and Y is a defined order, right? And Z is a existence of disorder, right? When I had first like talked about this, and it was a presentation originally, right? When I talked about it, I basically grabbed a bunch of papers and I said, look, like I have these sets of papers, right? What conditions can I order these papers in? I'll tell y'all right now that these papers being ordered perfectly stacked on top of each other with no disalignment is order. Okay, I put them on the table just like that, and I said, "Is there anything for me to do?" Right? And people were like, "No." I'm like, "Exactly, right?" Because my job is justified insofar as there's a problem with this stack of papers. So what did I do? I scrambled them, and I said, "Okay, now what do I have to do?" Well, it said you got to put them back together. Exactly the point, right? If there's no disorder, there's no reason for the political to exist, right? And we have to remember that the political also always has to reconstitute and reproduce itself. And that's why there is a construction of blackness. That's why a people are blackened. That's why there are conditions enforced on people that make there be that contradiction and that antagonism lying at at the core of the
Mhm.
political, right? Because the political structures itself against that disorder. And this is where the condition we see blackness sitting in, right? This is what blackness ends up serving, right? And whenever the black person who is necessarily non-human in the political world, who the political is supposed to impose a condition of non-humanness on, because the person is human, just because that's how you exist, right? Then guess what? If I want to assert my humanity, then I'm already pushing it back against the political, right? And this is the disorder it sees. And that's why policing, colonization, do this, do this, do this, do
Mhm.
this, anything to beat blackness back into its proper place. And this is why we have that dehumanization, right, baked into that structure. And that's why
Yeah.
I'm saying, like, with foundationality, right, that we have a situation of disorder that's foundational to the political, as opposed to an inevitable resistance to hierarchy, right? It's two discussion, right?
Yeah, and in that context, the anti-political is grounded in the power with, and it's a horizontal power sustained through autonomous self-organization. Where does that already appear in Black communities, and how does it differ from representation within the political?
Yeah. So that's the fire part. I actually it's Ensemble Zasu Akama. Please cut that up so I don't so I didn't
Yeah.
get their name wrong. But basically what she discusses in her work, which is like fire, right, is the fact that there are two dynamics, right, that type of that different types of nationalisms can embrace, right? And I found this so interesting. I've been reading about it recently, right? Is the fact that nationalism, interestingly, is situated in this political sphere, right? And in many ways, you have a situation where if a certain nation, like a black nation, like to say a New Africa, right, is positioned right against like in order to assert their autonomy and their self-determination, if they are oriented to in a way that they have to struggle against a broader political system, the political itself, then the structure or the way that the form that that struggle takes on in a political context may be anti-political, right? Now I'm pointing to this, right, because when it comes to anti-political dynamics, there are things that are there are necessary features of it, right? So
Mhm.
if one wants to actually like engage in that intentional disorder, right, and that disorder that's oriented purposefully and in an organized way towards rupture, then you have to negate the aspects that define the order of the political, right? And this is why we see in black communities, right? Okay, incorporation into the political and into the political world and political life comes through the embrace of the order that's been defined, comes with the embrace of the power structures at present, comes with the embrace of trying to climb up the ladder, right? Okay, now what we see on the other side, where that embrace is not necessarily there or where it is not available, is an embrace of alternatives. How do we get our needs met?
Mhm.
Okay, proverbially, like in
Mhm.
in a very real sense, right? Without naming it that, we're gonna
Mhm.
have some community mutual aid going, essentially, right? How do we
Mhm.
protect each other when we know the police are only here basically harass us? We see even presently up in Baltimore, there's groups out there doing the work of basically mediating situations, right? Taking placing what the cops' role is in that community, right? And it's like these types of
Mhm.
embraces of alternatives in terms of like more anarchic ways of organizing, more self determining ways of existing amongst each other, ways of building up autonomy in our
Mhm.
communities, right? Because of the way Blackness is positioned, is necessarily, you see what I mean, going to end up displacing the political because they have to be anarchic in form, right? And the way we end up living and asserting our humanity, right, in its truest sense, ends up being dissident, ends up being disorderly in the eyes of the political, even though it is completely coherent in our spaces amongst us because we know we need to do it because we're in the conditions. So yeah, I hope that answered the question. I feel like I kind of didn't.
In that you use the word rupture, and in your work, rupture appears both as insurrectionary sort of destruction
Mhm.
and this sustained construction against the imposed order. Why are they both necessary for you to for you as a thinker and an organizer?
Yeah. So this is very much related to a conversation I had with my partner at one time. We were talking about this, and I was basically saying like this thing is gonna crumble, right? It has to crumble. It has to crumble. Like, and maybe that's hope on my end, but I mean, at least it's not political hope. Anyway, that's something we talked about. The thing is gonna crumble. The question is always what will be built in its place, right? And in terms of like the anarchata statement that I referenced, the what's said is the world we're fighting for or what we're fighting for, right? And to what end is not to preserve this world, it's not to better it, it's not to change it, it's not to transform it in a radical way. Our end goal is to end it. And that's saying its end is our beginning,
Mhm.
right? And usually what people will think about when they hear that is okay, that means we just destroy the world and then we begin building a new one then, right? But this isn't what's being talked about, right? Even when we go to like the writing Black Armed Joy, right? A type of notes toward a black insurrectionary anarchism, right? When we go to that writing, even when there's discussion of the fact that we do what's necessary to combat, countervail, and bring down, right, violent systems where we're at to the best degree that we can right now, right? And it's talking about attack in this instance, right? But even when we're talking about this is not in a silo. It's baked into that assumption that we need to bring down the world. We need to play a part in that, right? Now, the reality though is that the beginning we're talking about is a beginning where we can name ourselves. You see what I mean? Because going back to what I said about how the
Yeah.
political world comes into being, like the white man or the political and all these systems that are constituted by it is what name us black. They impose the name on us, right? Now, when the world is ended, right? Then what we have is a situation where okay, we can name ourselves. But the process of ending it, right? And the process through which we build up the capacity to name ourselves and not just bring back up and reproduce the same structures is one that is a building process, right? If we're just talking about destroying, as Kwame Ture said, we're not talking about revolution. What the revolutionary must build, you know what I mean? Like that's the primary task, right? So this is why it's so vital to name both aspects of it and understand how they relate to each other, right? Because now, whenever we're looking at a situation where, okay, let's build up alternatives, we're talking about a constructive aspect. We're talking about a prefigurative aspect. That's when we're looking at like folks doing stuff like what Cooperation Jackson is doing and what a lot of different similar formations are doing across contexts, right? When we're talking about doing stuff that like we do with Black Mindedness in terms of knocking on doors and figuring out how can we coordinate, you feel me, coordinate resources and people and figure out a way
Mhm.
to build up a system that operates autonomously, right, from this broader political apparatus. When we're talking about that, we're talking about a prefigurative element, but the thing that makes that process ruptural or a rupturing process is the orientation of it. You see what I mean? If it's oriented against the political in name and in practice, then that makes it a ruptural practice. It's just a slow burn. It is something where you're erecting a structure and then, you know what I mean, it's kind of piercing the sky a little bit and making a rip there, right? Now, when we're talking about the insurrectionary attack type of vibes of it, right? That's those moments of rebellion or outright refusal, right? These things that the political doesn't see as just a cut. It's like, oh, you opened up a gap, right? So that little hole was poked in the sky. Now somebody's going to the top of the building and ripping it all the way down. You know what I mean? And exposing the
Mhm.
thing bare naked in all of its fragility, right? And when that happens, now there's more space for those structures that have been getting erected through these prefigurative practices to like basically take up the space. And now it's a question of, okay, how do we
Mhm.
play off these two dynamics and expand that space? How do we take more away from it and let more crumble, right? Without losing the things we need to live and the things we need in order to self-determine and name ourselves, right? And that's the dynamic there, and that's what's kind of named as that intentional disorder, right? That disorder that is only disorder in the eyes of the political. That disorder that is completely, you feel me, not necessarily orderly, right? But that disorder that is freeing for us, something that's building for us, right? Making the conditions where we can be free. So yeah.
The political absorbs demands for justice, sovereignty, and rebellion. How does that allow it to survive even resistance? Or how does resistance become the fuel for the political
So okay, so
in your mind?
yeah, this was an interesting part. And I felt like I hate how like I'm being self-critical about it, but I do think like to some degree that part was undercut, right? At the same time though, the black resistance element, especially in Black Hope and Practice, right, is naming what wasn't named there was the orientation aspect. It's assumed what the
Mhm.
orientation is towards, right? But this goes back into kind of what Ensemble was talking about in terms of the orientation of nationalist struggles, right? We may see some nationalist struggles that produce a nation state, right? That try and assert the sovereignty of a nation through statehood, right? Well, you embrace that
Yeah.
statehood, and while okay, you might have knocked off this imperialist bloc, right? Well, you're still getting incorporated into the broader structure of a
Yeah.
general order that you know what I mean only views statehood through the eyes or through views nationhood and sovereignty through the eyes of through nation states. So what ends up happening is okay, now you're getting incorporated into these UN talks. You feel me? Now you're having a footsies with a bunch of different states between the US, these European nations, China, Russia. You have to do all these different things in order to try and protect your sovereignty. But whose sovereignty are you protecting at the end of the day? In some instance, yeah, there's a degree to which as the statesman you're thinking, okay, let me make sure my people are okay. But what you're protecting is the state apparatus, right? And that's
Mhm.
not like this hyper big critique. That's a structural reality of what's happening. You know what I mean? And we can name it, right? So what we're
Yeah.
saying in terms of that's one way that sovereignty can
Yeah.
be asserted, right? And this is a situation where you see resistance, the resistance that brought about that overthrow of power, that brought about that nation state, that was oriented towards incorporation at the end of the day. And that's the Black
Yeah.
resistance that is leaning into a political hope, that is hoping there is a sovereign nation of whatever people within the political world, right? That's a danger, right? Now,
Mhm.
a type of nationalist project, right, that understands nationhood as resting in the people, that understands sovereignty as being expressed and manifest through the way people function amongst other nations, right? As like a Sanyika Shakur has talked about before, right? The type of nationalism that understands it in that way, right, specifically aims to assert nationhood at the most basic level amongst people, the nationhood of a people. And what does that look like? That looks like autonomy. You know what I mean? If we're talking about national sovereignty for a people that does not rest itself in a nation state, right? And that does not seek incorporation, we're talking about getting free. Period. We're talking about rupturing the
Mm-hmm.
order that exists. Period. Because the world we live in cannot by any means recognize nations that are not vested in a nation state. And this is why it's so
Yeah.
vital to, you know what I mean, embrace that people aspect, because the moment we embrace that type of nationhood and that assertion of sovereignty that seeks a rupture, right? Now we're embracing a type of resistance, and the resistance that's necessary for it is oriented against the political, and that makes it liberationist. That makes it something that's world ending. That makes it something to where we can build the conditions and create the conditions and operate in the conditions necessary for us to be free. Yeah.
So wrapping up the last two questions, I'll just begin. Black refusal is expressed materially, organizing outside political legibility and building Black community autonomy. What does that look like for you on a day-to-day level, and how does practice itself become hope?
Yeah. So the on the first bit, loud is like organizing without legibility. Look on a practical level. What's very interesting, and this is like I find this to be the coolest part about this, is because I think a lot of times what people imagine when they hear like these certain ideas is like is something um spectacular. Is like something but the crazy part is what I've learned is like to organize against being legible to the political and legible to political institutions and different things like that comes in the most minute decisions, right? And what those things produce in the future options that open up to you through those decisions. For instance, like I'll speak
Hmm.
on it on a campus level, and then I'll speak on it on a broader level. On a campus level, we
Yeah,
had
of
an
course.
issue after the encampments, right? Where
Hmm.
there were conversations about trying to have conversations with the administration about getting certain needs met, right? Now, this was happening in
Hmm.
pro-Palestine organizing spaces, right? At the same time in the Black community, and this is something I'd been advocating for about 2 years at that point, I was saying we don't need to be registering our student organizations, right? Especially ones that are focused on organizing students, right? So with Black Mindedness, from the very jump, the first thing we said was we will not register our student organization, right? And we will not become a university initiative. In no way will we be something that the university can name as existing, right?
Interesting.
Never, right? And this was a hard line we held. And while we were organizing and while we were building up our stuff, while we were holding different spaces and what I mean, doing different kind of political education type events without getting formal recognition, right? We had administrators come up to newer members, right? Trying to go behind my back and other people's back, come up to newer members and be like, hey, y'all should really register this as a nonprofit. Hey, y'all should really, what's it called? Start doing the RSO process so y'all can get funding from us. Y'all should really make this an initiative with the university so you can get a bigger platform, right? But it's like, no, we're not going to do that, right? Instead, what we
Hmm.
did was we said, okay, we are going to make it to where intentionally we don't have access to anything you can offer us, nothing you can offer us, right? And
Hmm.
instead, what we're going to do is we're going to walk into the dorm where Black freshmen live, and we're going to knock on every single door every single week. We're going to make it a rule amongst each other that when we see Black people walking on campus, we're going to walk up to them and we're going to have these flyers with us and we're going to tell them about what we're doing. Within 4 or 5
Hmm.
months, like large swaths of the Black community knew exactly who we were, knew exactly what we do, and that dynamic persists to this day. And you know what else happened through it was that even the organizations that were registered and were not operating like that do a lot of the exact same practices that we do in order to bring people out. So now there's conversations about not leaning on the university so much and leaning more into each other that weren't possible until we took that step to say, we will not buy into the university structure and believe that they have more to offer us than our community does, right? That's the
Yeah.
smallest decision, right? Just saying we're not going to do this. That small act of refusal led to a whole different way of building happening, right? And that's the same type of thing
Hmm.
that has happened as we've moved towards more grassroots stuff. What have we said? We've said, okay,
Hmm.
we are not going to become a nonprofit. We are never going to have a bank account. We are never going to have any of these things. We defined our purpose, right? And our mission, that is to organize, to meet community needs, to build grassroots power and further our people's self-determination. We defined our mission as something that we don't need those things to do, right? And
Yeah.
because we did that, now it's a thing of whenever we're talking about, oh, how do we get money for this thing? It's not a question of, okay, let's fundraise, get money into our account and then do this, right? The question for us now is, okay, actually, what resources are there in the area that can help support this need? And how do we connect that properly? How do we get people where we're at to be able to connect to these resources better? How do we connect this organization to this organization to this infrastructure? And you see what's being created is a kind of coordinating node in a broader struggle, right? That enables that coordination to happen without legibility and without recognition from the government, right? And that small decision, we're not going to have a bank account. We are not going to be a nonprofit. That's an act of refusal that is so minuscule and can seem inconsequential to some, but that it produces a different way that you build. And this is why I say the big thing is orientation. Because if you act in alignment with the orientation and you orient yourself towards a certain type of rupture, then you make decisions that will remove options of incorporation from you and further put you on that path toward rupture. And the further you walk down it, the harder it is to walk back. You know what I mean? So, yeah.
So I want to close with your insistence, to hell with this world, we gonna live. What makes that declaration more than a slogan? What makes it hope in practice? And what does living require in that sense?
Yeah, so this is the major thing that's kind of structured my thinking for a while. And a lot of times when we talk about is like when we're talking about anti-blackness in the political world, we're talking about, and even like even on an ontological level, we're talking about anti-black world making, right? It's this understanding that we are always building something. We are always organized towards some end. We're always reproducing something with where our energies are being funneled into. What are we reproducing right now? We're reproducing a world that is built on the oppression of colonized peoples, of black bodies, of gendered, gendered people who gender hierarchies are structured against, right? We're against disabled people, all these different things. We are in a world where we're organized towards reproducing the systems that harm humanity. We are organized towards the destruction of the planet, for goodness sake. You know what I mean? We're organized towards not being able to even think for ourselves because of how much we end up buying into certain things that are popping up, right? We are organized towards reproducing what many could call hell. You know what I mean? This is a hell that we're living in, right? Now, the question for us is, what do we do within it, right? We understand that we're reproducing it. We understand that we're the firewood within the hell. We understand that at every moment, while we're sitting in this and while we're not struggling to get out of it, you know, we're in a spot where we are reproducing it. But we also understand that this world, right? This world can only exist as this, right? This world can only be hell. This world can only be that. So what is it incumbent on us to do? Instead of saying, let's unhell hell, no, the world can only be that. To hell with it. Let it be. Let it be what it is, right? And leave it. Do the work necessary to break away from it, to build something else, to literally leave it as what it is and leave it behind, right? Look the other way, do what you got to do, you know? And that's the big thing about to hell with this world. And then when I say we're going to live, right?
Yeah.
The point that we're going to live is because, well, what are we doing? We're living, dying. We're walking dead. The world is structured on our ongoing death, right? So when I'm saying that, it's like, no, if we want to live, what we have to do is say to hell with this world, build something else, create the conditions under which we can live. We can live in a way that's not structured against our very being, against our life, that is structured to make us die, literally, right? And if we create the conditions in a new world, right, for us to live in that way, then that assertion, we will live, will have been fulfilled. You know what I mean? And that's the bigger thing of that. And that's why it's such a vital slogan, because it puts all that in such a such plain terms. You know what I mean? Yeah, that's
On that note, thank you for appearing on the Organic Filaments Network. And any last words? Want to share your Substack or anything like that? Mm.
yeah, no, thank you for having me. This is really cool. Like I said, I'll be watching the different episodes and stuff like that. So I really do appreciate us
Yeah,
getting to talk. When it comes to my
yeah,
Substack is that Anarchata Muslim. I talk about like all of these things, and a lot of times more of my like reflective pieces kind of draw on my own personal experiences, organizing, and just my personal experiences growing up and trying and becoming politicized in the way that I am now. So that's where my Substack is. My Instagram is the same. It's that at that Anarchata Muslim. And I also want to shout out a couple of others who have very aligned politics and who honestly like a lot of my analysis like draws on their
yeah,
thinking, right? And a couple of those people, one I've mentioned Ensemble a few times, but her thinking is very crucial. Her Substack is Anarcha Pantherist, right? Anarcha is spelled Anarqa and then dash Pantherist. The next one
yeah,
is Nomi. Nomi is somebody who's like a mentor for me when it comes to organizing and when it comes to even my political thought. So Nomi's Substack is Pedagogy of the Depressed. She's writing about a lot of like just very what would be the thing? Resistance and kind of protagonism infused forms of anti-humanism, right? So it's a very interesting play off of like Afro pessimism and Black fugitivity, right? And different frameworks within Marxism to discuss, oh, how do we create a type of Black politics that sees
yeah,
itself as agents that is trying to struggle against the world to create something new through a type of fugitivity. It's really cool. The third is Dr. Muhammad Abdul. I'm Muslim, you know what I mean, and reading Dr. Abdul's work and being able to engage with him, especially in his reading group, right, has really been able to kind of make me cohere certain ideas and certain and you know his work through Islam and anarchism and his Substack post, and his Substack is End Times. And then who's gonna be my last one? You know what? The last one I'm gonna do, I'm gonna say go Charlie Banga, Anarcha Samaya, and then on Instagram, CJ, which is I am underscore CJ, and then Ro, whose Instagram is Eden dot 17. Boom.
yeah. That's necessary. That was our conversation with Emon Green. We've been thinking through living, dying, blackening, imposed order, necessary disorder, and the distinction between political hope and hope in practice. These aren't abstract questions, they press on how we understand political life itself. If you found this conversation valuable, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you want to support the work, visit buymeacoffee.com/organic filaments network. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.